Howdy and welcome to part 2 of forging a rifleman's knife. So in part 1 we forged out 2 blades, and as you can see here we're just kind of comparing each one to our original drawing. Now one blade is going to be almost identical to the original drawing, and then we're going to go in a complete different direction for the second blade. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So I've gone ahead and profiled the blade, and what I'm going to do here is start putting in my bevels. Now because this is an 18th century style blade, I want to kind of challenge myself and only use, well, for the most part, use tools that they would have used back in that time period. So instead of using a belt grinder here, I'm just going to come in with a file and very slowly remove that scale and start to put my bevels in this way. Now you can hear that high-pitched tone that metal gets when that file is skating across the scale, and that's because the scale is so hard. So I would recommend that if you are going to use a file for this, go ahead and soak the blade overnight in vinegar. And that vinegar is gonna get into that metal and actually kind of help pop that scale off. And then you should be able to just use a file and very carefully just go over the metal, and that scale will just rip right off with the file. You'll notice now that I'm actually filing along the blade, or with the grain of the blade. And this is going to do a few things. One, this is going to relieve any stress marks or stress fractures that we might get during the heat treat. This is also going to give it more of a period accurate or historically correct look. So back then they didn't have sandpaper, and they would have just used files for this. Similar to when we hand sand, I'm just forcing all the scratch lines to go along with the blade. It's just going to give it a nicer finish when it's completely done. It's still going to look rough, but that's kind of the idea here. I just want to create something that looks like it could have been done in the 1700s. I've gone ahead and filed both sides of the blade, and now I've got this blade chucked up in a vise inside of what's called a file guide. And I'm just going to slowly work on the tang, get this filed down. This is going to create a nice section between where the blade meets up with the handle, and it's going to ensure that everything is square and 90 degrees in relation to one another. Now, because I'm doing what I would call a historical finish or a forged finish on this knife, I need to kind of rearrange the steps in the knife making process. So here I'm going to go ahead and prep the blade to put my maker's mark on, and usually this is something that would be done pretty much at the end of the entire process. So I've gone ahead and used acetone to wipe off and clean any impurities off of the blade before we go ahead and move into the etching. Here I'm going to go ahead and lay out my template, just make sure that everything's lined up and looks correct. And then I'll go ahead and begin the etching process. Through my experience, I find that about 2 minutes of total etching time gives the proper desired depth that I'm looking for. It's not so deep that it really catches the fingernail and looks bad, and yet it's not too shallow that, it could rub off or get scraped off eventually. So I personally like to etch in 10-second intervals and just remove it. That way I can make sure that nothing weird is going on, and I'll just do that for about 2 minutes of total etching time. Once the etch is complete, I'll use a special cleaner, remove any of that impurity, get everything off of the blade, and then we can move right into heat treat preparation. To begin the heat treat process, we need to normalize each blade. Because this is 5160 steel, it's a fairly simple steel to work with, so we're just going to heat it up past critical temperature, and then let each blade air cool till all the color in each blade is gone. Then we'll heat it back up again, only this time bringing it just below critical temperature. And then we'll let it air cool again until all the color is gone. And then we'll repeat that step one more time. Then we can move on to the actual heat treat of the blade. Alright, now that both blades have been quenched, let's go ahead and check out the hardness level pre-temper. so we can hear how high pitched that edge is compared to the spine and the tang. And again, that high pitch is what we want. And since both knives were heat treated exactly the same, there's no need to test the other knife. Okay, both knives have been tempered, and both knives are sitting at right about 58 Rockwell. So we're going to set one aside and turn our focus to the guard version of this Rifleman's knife. Lucky enough for me, I was able to scrounge around the shop and actually came across an unfinished guard and spacer that'll work perfect for this project. Now, I say that, but the slot in both of these pieces for the tang is a bit too large, and because these were not made specifically for this knife, that's bound to happen. But because this is a test knife or prototype knife, if you will, I'm perfectly fine with the tolerances not really meeting up to my standard. Now let's check out this handle. So I'm going to be using a piece of antler for this. Now this specific antler comes from Texas, from a deer called an axis deer, and this was sent in by a really good friend of mine, but I figured it would be a good opportunity to kind of test out this antler and see how it works. Now what's different between this one and say whitetail deer antler? Well, as you can see, the center is completely solid all the way through. Now with whitetail, or even elk, the interior of the antler is very porous, it's very soft, almost like a spongy material. But with this being completely solid, it's going to be a bit more heavy, it's going to be more dense, so it'll balance out a little bit better on the knife when it's finished, and it's just going to make for a very structurally sound handle. Now we're going to turn our attention to shaping the spacer. Now this could be done on a belt grinder, but I'm just going to use a file for this because, like I said earlier, since this is an 18th century style blade, I want to kind of challenge myself to use as little as modern tools as possible here. So again, I'm just going to come in with the file, remove these corners on this square spacer, make it a nice round circle, and then we'll move into drawing out a guard design, cutting that out, and shaping that. Alright, went ahead and cut out this guard out of that rectangular piece, and as you can see, nothing is symmetrical as of now, and that's perfectly fine. Let's go ahead and put this thing in a vise and start refining the shape with a series of files. Now that all the file work is done and all the corners and sharp edges are rounded off, I'm going to go ahead and start forging in these scrolls on each side of the guard. Now originally I was going to do an S guard, but I figured why not change things up and try something that personally I've not seen done before. So I'm just going to come in on either side of the guard and I'm going to create these scrolls or pigtails, whatever you want to call them. If you check out my how to forge a blanket pin video, I actually go in depth in that video on how to effectively forge these pigtails or scrolls. So if you want to learn how to do that, go ahead and check that out. But anyways, I'm just going to forge these in on both sides and then we can move on to actually fitting the guard up onto the blade. Alright, it's time for the test fit up. Now keep in mind that the guard, spacer, and handle are nowhere near being complete yet. Still have a lot of shaping to do, have some file work to do on the spacer, a lot of shaping to do on the handle. We still have to create a pommel and a pommel nut. So the handle construction is nowhere near being finished, but we need to make sure that everything fits up nice and tight and that each and every part mates up to one another before we move on to anything else. And this is what the build is looking like so far. I'm really digging that kind of downward swoop that antler has. I think it gives a real nice effect to the overall look of the knife, and I'm really liking the way that guard turned out. But anyways, this is going to wrap up part 2. In part 3, we'll finish up the guard. We'll add the alignment pins. We'll finish up the spacer and the antler, and we'll also create the pommel and pommel nut. And then after all that's finished, then we'll start working on a sheath. If you liked the video and you haven't already, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments about anything you saw in this video, feel free to put them down below. If you'd like to stay up to date on current projects and upcoming videos, go ahead and check out my Instagram. It'll be linked down in the description. And remember to keep your tools sharp and your mind sharper, and thanks for watching.